On the evening of June the 5th, 1944, as the cold winds swept across southern England, the airfields were alive with tension. For months, Allied planners had worked on a single, impossible task: tear open Hitler's fortress Europe with a massive amphibious invasion. Yet for all the tanks, ships, and men that would storm the beaches at dawn, the entire operation depended on a smaller, more dangerous gamble: an airborne strike deep behind German lines. The men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had trained relentlessly for this night. They were young, many just out of high school, carrying more equipment than seemed humanly possible: rifles, grenades, radios, demolition charges, even inflatable lifebelts in case they landed in Normandy's flooded fields. Each man's heart pounded with the knowledge that the first blows of Operation Overlord would be struck not by the infantry landing on Utah or Omaha beaches, but by them, dropping into darkness. The stakes. The mission was clear, yet nearly suicidal. Parachute into occupied France hours before the seaborne invasion, capture key bridges, secure crossroads, destroy enemy batteries, and above all, sow confusion. If German reinforcements moved freely to the coast, the landings could be crushed on the sand. If the paratroopers failed, the invasion itself might collapse within hours. Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower understood this risk better than anyone. The night before, he walked among the airborne troops, shaking hands, offering quiet words. His face betrayed the burden of history resting on his shoulders. As he bid them farewell, he knew some would never return. "The eyes of the world are upon you," he had told them in his order of the day. And indeed, the world would remember them as the first Americans to hurl themselves into occupied France. The takeoff. Shortly before midnight, the skies thundered to life. Hundreds of C-47 Skytrain transport planes, their wings painted with invasion stripes for recognition, roared down the runways. In their bellies sat the paratroopers, faces blackened with charcoal, helmets strapped tight, harnesses heavy with gear. Inside each plane, red lights glowed, casting eerie shadows as men checked weapons and prayed. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and nervous anticipation. Engines droned so loud that thoughts became whispers in the skull. Some men chewed gum furiously, others gripped rosaries. A few vomited into bags before buckling in again. They all knew the odds. The Germans were waiting. Crossing the Channel, as the vast armada of planes crossed the English Channel, the darkness below flickered with the shadows of thousands of ships already moving toward Normandy. The largest invasion fleet in history crept silently through the waves. Above them, the airborne spearhead pressed forward into danger. German radar detected the incoming wave, and soon flak guns opened fire. The night sky erupted into chaos, black bursts of smoke, flaming tracers, and brilliant arcs of death. Pilots swerved violently to avoid fire, scattering formations. In the holds, paratroopers were hurled sideways, crushed against one another, their stomachs twisting with fear and turbulence. The green light would come any moment, and with it, the plunge into uncertainty. The jump. At 00:15 on June 6, 1944, the first sticks of American paratroopers leapt into the night. Doors slid open. The roar of engines became a hurricane, and men shuffled toward the edge. "Go, go, go!" screamed jumpmasters, shoving troopers into the void. One after another, they vanished into blackness. The rush of wind tore away breath, parachutes snapped open with bone-jarring force, and the fields of Normandy yawned below. For some, the descent was smooth, surreal, floating through darkness lit only by flares and tracers. For others, it was terror. Many were riddled by ground fire before their boots touched soil. Scattered to the wind. The plan had been precise. Drop zones carefully mapped, units meant to regroup swiftly. But in war, precision is a dream. Heavy flak and poor navigation scattered the drops across 30 miles of countryside. Men landed in orchards, rivers, and flooded marshes deliberately created by the Germans. Some drowned, weighed down by gear. Others crashed through rooftops, landing in kitchens where terrified French civilians stared at the sudden invaders. Yet amid this chaos, something remarkable unfolded. Groups of 2, 5, maybe 10 men, strangers from different companies, banded together and began fighting as though they were whole battalions. The Germans, hearing gunfire erupt across their rear, panicked. Radio reports described parachutists everywhere. To commanders in bunkers, it seemed the night sky itself had rained an army. The first skirmishes. In one hedgerow, a handful of paratroopers ambushed a German convoy, blasting it apart with bazookas. In another village, 3 men stormed a machine gun nest and turned the weapon on its owners. Engineers blew bridges, cut phone lines, and sowed mines. The 101st Airborne, known as the Screaming Eagles, fought bitterly for control of causeways leading from Utah Beach. Without these narrow exits through the flooded lowlands, the beach landings would bottleneck and fail. Blood stained the fields as scattered platoons seized one farmhouse after another, rooting out defenders with grenades and bayonets. Meanwhile, the 82nd Airborne aimed to seize bridges over the Merdore River and secure the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. But here too, disaster and heroism collided. Sainte-Mère-Église, shortly after midnight, the town of Sainte-Mère-Église was ablaze. A building fire lit the night, and German troops scrambled in confusion. Into this inferno drifted paratroopers, canopies glowing red in the firelight. Many were cut down before they soared, hit the ground, helpless in mid-air. One trooper, John Steele, became entangled on the church steeple, dangling above the square as gunfire raged below. Playing dead, he survived to witness the first French town liberated by Americans that morning. The capture of Sainte-Mère-Église became one of the first footholds of the invasion, secured at enormous cost. The sight of American flags raised over the village electrified both Allies and French civilians, signaling that liberation had begun. German paralysis. To the German 7th Army, the situation was a nightmare. Reports flowed in. Dozens of firefights, bridges lost, roads blocked, gun batteries silenced. Panicked messages spoke of thousands of parachutists, far more than the reality. German reserves that might have counterattacked the beaches were immobilized, unsure where to strike. Field Marshal Rommel himself, the Desert Fox, was away from Normandy that night. The absence of key leadership compounded the paralysis. By dawn, German defences along Utah Beach were cut off, disoriented, and unable to respond coherently. Dawn on D-Day. As the first light broke, exhausted paratroopers held crossroads with dwindling ammunition. They were isolated, surrounded, but unyielding. From hedgerows and barns, they fired on German columns, delaying them minute by minute. Each delay, each destroyed vehicle, bought precious time for the soldiers storming ashore. When the first American troops waded onto Utah Beach, they found pathways cleared by their airborne brothers. Without those night drops, without the scattered, desperate stands of the paratroopers, the beachheads might have been choked with blood and steel. Legacy of the night. The night drop was costly. Over 2,000 American paratroopers were killed, captured, or missing by the end of June 6th. Yet their sacrifice accomplished the impossible. By overwhelming the Germans with confuses, they turned chaos into strategy, and strategy into victory. Every village, every hedgerow where a paratrooper fought became a thread in the greater tapestry of D-Day's success. The chaos of the drop. By the time the last waves of C-47 transports had disgorged their human cargo into the darkness over Normandy, the countryside was alive with confusion. Tracers still streaked the sky, flak bursts drifted like poisonous clouds, and parachutes hung from hedges, rooftops, and telephone poles. The plan had been neat lines on a map, but the reality was a storm of randomness. Entire sticks of paratroopers were dropped miles from their intended zones. Some companies found themselves separated not by fields, but by entire villages. Yet in that chaos lay a strange advantage. The Germans, whose doctrine depended on knowing the enemy's strength and location, were confronted with a nightmare. Reports of firefights from every compass point. To commanders in bunkers, it seemed the Americans were everywhere at once. The terrain of Normandy, the bocage, those ancient hedgerows of Normandy, shaped the battle in ways planners could never fully predict. Thick earthen embankments topped with tangled brush created natural fortresses, each field a miniature battlefield. For paratroopers who lacked tanks or artillery, the bocage offered both cover and terror. Every corner could conceal a German machine gun. Every field had to be fought for, foot by foot. Yet the same terrain that slowed Allied progress also fractured German counterattacks. Columns of armour or infantry could not manoeuvre easily through the hedgerows. Instead of sweeping the invaders into the sea, the Germans found themselves locked in a maze where small groups of Americans could ambush, delay, and bleed them. Improvised command, for officers like Brigadier General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne, the night was an exercise in improvisation. With units scattered, traditional command structures evaporated. Soldiers of different companies, even different divisions, gathered under whichever lead, stood tallest. A lieutenant with 20 men might suddenly find himself commanding a scratch force of 80. Captains became de facto battalion commanders. This flexibility became a hallmark of the airborne ethos. Training had emphasized initiative. If you land alone, you still have a mission. Blow a bridge, cut a wire, kill Germans, whatever denies the enemy freedom of movement. That doctrine saved the invasion. Sainte-Mère-Église holds. By dawn, Sainte-Mère-Église, secured by elements of the 82nd, had become a vital anchor. French civilians peered from cellars as Americans patrolled the smoking ruins, setting up roadblocks and bracing for counterattack. The Germans tried repeatedly to dislodge them, but each assault met determined rifle fire, machine guns set up in windows, and bazookas aimed down narrow streets. The cost was high, paratroopers fell in droves, but Sainte-Mère-Église remained in American hands. That single town, lit by the tragic fire that had illuminated descending troopers, became the first liberated community in Normandy. Its capture severed German control of the Carentan Peninsula's main roads, directly supporting Utah Beach. The causeways to Utah. Meanwhile, the 101st struggled for control of the causeways behind Utah Beach. Without these narrow exits, American forces landing on the sand would be trapped, unable to move inland. German defenders, entrenched in farmhouses and bunkers, poured fire onto every approach. Paratroopers, often in groups of fewer than a dozen, stormed positions with grenades and bayonets. Engineers used satchel charges to blast open strongpoints. By mid-morning, battered but unbroken, the Screaming Eagles controlled enough ground to guarantee that the beach assault would not choke. Voices from the night. Survivor accounts reveal the sheer brutality of those hours. Private Jim Red McNally of the 101st recalled, "We landed, nowhere near where we were supposed to. There were maybe 5 of us. We didn't know the roads, didn't know where the rest were, but we had one rule, move toward gunfire. And wherever we heard shooting, that's where we went. By the time we reached a crossroads, there were 30 of us. None from my platoon, but all with the same look in their eyes. We set up a roadblock and waited. The first German truck that came through, we let them get close, then opened fire. After that, the night never seemed to end." Such improvisation, repeated hundreds of times across Normandy, shattered German mobility. German confusion. The German 91st Infantry Division, tasked with holding the Carentan Peninsula, reeled under the airborne onslaught. Messages intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed utter disarray. 02:30 a.m. Enemy parachutists reported near Sainte-Mère-Église. 3:15 a.m. Enemy forces at Lafayette Bridge, situation unclear. 4:00 a.m. Parachutists reported in all directions, strength unknown. What the Germans perceived as a massive coordinated drop was in reality fragmented groups, but the psychological effect was devastating. Commanders hesitated, unsure whether to commit reserves. Precious hours slipped away, the very hours Eisenhower's planners had gambled upon. Lafayette Bridge. Perhaps nowhere was the battle more desperate than at Lafayette Bridge, spanning the Merderet River. For the 82nd Airborne, holding this crossing was critical. Without it, German armour could sweep east and smash the landings. The fight raged for days, beginning in those first hours. Paratroopers, vastly outnumbered, dug in around the stone bridge and nearby manor house. German infantry, supported by armour, hurled repeated assaults. At one point, paratroopers used captured anti-tank guns to knock out advancing vehicles. Ammunition ran perilously low, men scavenged from the dead. The bridge changed hands multiple times, each exchange soaking the fields in blood. Only the relentless tenacity of small American units prevented the Germans from breaking through. The price paid, by the end of D-Day, casualties among the airborne were staggering. Entire sticks had been wiped out before their boots touched ground. Others drowned in flooded marshes, weighed down by 100 pounds of equipment. Many were captured, executed, or simply vanished. Yet their sacrifice achieved the impossible. German reinforcements bound for the beaches found roads blocked, bridges destroyed, and crossroads bristling with ambushes. Tanks and artillery that might have reached Utah or Omaha in the morning were still fighting through the bocage by nightfall. The paratroopers had bought time with their lives. French resistance joins. Throughout the night and following day, the French resistance emerged from the shadows. Farmers guided scattered paratroopers to friendly positions. Villagers carried messages, hid wounded men, and pointed out German strongpoints. In Sainte-Mère-Église, civilians dragged the wounded to barns and cellars despite the risk of execution. This cooperation underscored the broader meaning of the airborne mission. Liberation had begun. Ordinary French people, starved under occupation, now saw American uniforms in their streets. Even in chaos, hope spread. A different kind of victory. By June 7th, the Airborne Divisions had suffered enormous losses, up to 1/3 of their strength. Yet their mission was judged a success, not because everything went according to plan, but because nothing had. The scattering, the improvisation, the small bands fighting alone, these unintended outcomes overwhelmed German command and paralyzed their response. Military historians would later note that the D-Day airborne operation defied textbook definitions of victory. It was not orderly, it was not clean, and it certainly was not precise, but it worked. The Germans had been thrown into confusion, their reserves delayed, and their defences fractured at the moment of greatest need. And for the men who survived, battered and blooded in the bocage, victory was measured not in maps and orders, but in the simple fact that they were still standing, the morning after. When the first rays of June 6th's dawn broke over Normandy, the airborne troopers who had survived the night found themselves in a land both liberated and lethal. Smoke drifted across farm fields. Hedgerows were littered with parachutes, some empty, others shrouding the lifeless forms of their owners. Villages echoed with sporadic gunfire, punctuated by the distant rumble of artillery from the beaches. What had begun as a scatter of confused drops was now hardening into a network of strongpoints. Exhausted, blooded, and often cut off, paratroopers dug into the bocage, awaiting the inevitable German counterattack. The German response. For the Germans, dawn revealed the extent of the crisis. Communications were severed, bridges lost, and roads blocked. Yet one fact was clear. American paratroopers were everywhere. Reports exaggerated their strength into tens of thousands. German doctrine demanded swift counterattack. The 91st Infantry Division, along with paratroopers of the elite Fallschirmjäger, began to converge on American positions. Armored units rumbled from inland garrisons, their orders clear: drive the invaders back into the sea before the beachhead solidified. But between those armored columns and the coast stood scattered clusters of American airborne troops. Outnumbered and under-equipped, they would be asked to hold far beyond what seemed possible. Crossroads of blood. One of the most vital missions fell to small airborne groups holding crossroads near Carentan, the town that linked Utah and Omaha beaches. If the Germans could retake Carentan, they would divide the American beachheads, strangling the invasion in its infancy. Paratroopers barricaded crossroads with overturned wagons, sandbags, and the bodies of dead livestock. They mined approaches and strung wire. Armed with rifles, BARs, and a handful of bazookas, they waited. The first Gersart man probe came mid-morning, a column of infantry supported by armored cars. The Americans held fire until the enemy was nearly on top of them, then unleashed a storm of lead. Bazooka teams darted from hedges to blast vehicles, then melted away before German return fire. For hours, the crossroads was a slaughterhouse. When the smoke cleared, dozens of Germans lay dead. The Americans had lost heavily too, but the line held. That crossroads never fell. Lafayette, the stone bridge. Nowhere was the fight bloodier than Lafayette Bridge, where paratroopers of the 82nd faced waves of German counterattacks. By dawn, the Merderet River ran red. German tanks, attempting to break across, were met by bazooka fire and captured artillery. At one desperate moment, paratroopers strapped demolition charges to their bodies, hurling themselves beneath advancing armor. For 3 days the battle raged. Each German assault was repelled by furious small arms fire from farmhouses and hedgerows. The stone bridge, barely 50 yards long, became a symbol of airborne defiance. Survivors would later recall that the air reeked of cordite and blood, the cries of the wounded mingling with the unceasing rattle of machine guns. Holding Lafayette denied the Germans their most direct route to Utah Beach. Without that choke point, the landing forces behind the sand were spared annihilation. Sainte-Mère-Église defended. Meanwhile, Sainte-Mère-Église, the town first liberated in the early hours, endured counterblows. German paratroopers of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment launched coordinated assaults, supported by artillery. Shells tore through stone walls, collapsing buildings onto defenders and civilians alike. The 82nd Airborne, though battered, fought with grim determination. Snipers occupied church towers, machine guns rattled from second-story windows, and mortars answered shell for shell. Civilians, hodars, gled in cellars, prayed for survival. After 2 days of combat, Sainte-Mère-Église still flew the American flag. After 2 days of combat, Sainte-Mère-Église still flew the American flag. Its defense prevented German units from splitting the Allied advance, cementing its place in history as one of the most crucial strongholds of D-Day. Individual heroics, stories of personal valor spread quickly among survivors. Private Charles de Glopper, manning a machine gun at Lafayette, held his ground while comrades withdrew. Alone, he raked German lines until he fell under withering fire, his sacrifice buying precious minutes. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Lieutenant Dick Winters of Easy Company, 506th PIR, led a daring assault on a German battery at Brécourt Manor. With just a handful of men, he outflanked and destroyed 4 105mm guns that threatened Utah Beach. The textbook small unit tactics he employed would later be studied by military academies worldwide. Such acts of heroism were repeated across Normandy. For every famous name, countless anonymous paratroopers bled and died in fields far from home, ensuring the invasion survived. German frustration. As June 6th wore on, German frustration mounted. Attempts to coordinate counterattacks faltered under relentless harassment. Bridges had been blown, roads mined, and ambushes sprung at every turn. German armour, meant to sweep across the Carentan peninsula, crawled forward, delayed by skirmishes that never seemed to end. Rommel's much-feared panzer divisions, which could have rolled into the beachheads, were paralysed by Hitler's insistence that they await his personal orders before moving. By the time permission came, it was too late. The paratroopers had done their job. Time had slipped away. Night falls again. As darkness returned on June 6th, the airborne still clung to their positions. Ammunition was low, rations nearly gone, and the wounded lay untreated in barns and ditches. Yet the men refused to yield. They had been told to hold until relieved. That order, simple and absolute, became their creed. Around campfires, whispers carried of comrades lost, of villages still in German hands, of the beaches far to the east where more Americans fought for survival. For many, it was their first day of combat. For others, it was their last. Eisenhower's gamble pays off. Back in England, Supreme Commander Eisenhower received reports through the night. The landings at Utah and Omaha were holding. Gold, Juno and Sword, the British and Canadian beaches, had also secured tenuous footholds. And everywhere, one refrain echoed: the airborne had succeeded. Not in the way planners had drawn it on maps, not with precision or order, but with courage, chaos, and sacrifice. They had held the Germans back long enough for the greatest amphibious invasion in history to survive its first crucial day. The human cost. By the end of June 6th, the US Airborne Divisions had suffered catastrophic losses. Out of approximately 13,000 men dropped, thousands were dead, wounded, or missing. Entire companies had been erased. Yet the price had purchased victory. The beaches stood. The Allies were ashore, and Hitler's vaunted Atlantic Wall had been breached. For the survivors, there was no triumph, only exhaustion and grief. They buried friends in shallow graves, marked by helmets and rifles. They cleaned weapons for battles yet to come. D-Day was only the beginning. The liberation of France lay ahead. Legacy forged in fire. The Airborne's stand in Normandy reshaped military history. Their ability to adapt in chaos, to fight as small units without central command, became a model for modern warfare. Their heroism inspired occupied peoples and strengthened Allied resolve. When historians speak of D-Day's success, they point not only to the beaches, but to the hedgerows, villages and bridges where paratroopers turned confusion into victory. Against overwhelming odds, America's airborne had held the line, the day after D-Day. By dawn on June 7, 1944, the fields of Normandy bore witness to the cost of liberation. Smoke still drifted from burning villages, parachutes littered hedgerows like ghostly shrouds, and the groans of the wounded mingled with the rumble of distant artillery. For the airborne divisions, the 82nd and 101st, D-Day had been a test of endurance, improvisation, and sheer willpower. They had survived the night drop, endured the first counterattacks, and held critical positions long enough for beachheads to form. Yet their battle was far from over. The coming days would prove even more brutal as German forces regrouped for sustained counteroffensives. Digging in. The scattered paratroopers began consolidating into coherent units. Commanders who had spent the night with only fragments of their companies now gathered survivors and established defensive perimeters. Engineers repaired radios, medics worked tirelessly on the wounded, and supply drops attempted to replenish dwindling ammunition. The villages of Sainte-Mère-Église, Carentan, and the crossroads near La Fière became rallying points. Foxholes were dug into the bocage, machine guns positioned to cover approaches, and roadblocks reinforced. The men were exhausted, many without sleep for more than 48 hours, but they knew the enemy was preparing to strike back with everything they had. German counterattacks. Intensify. On June 7th and 8th, German forces launched furious assaults across the Carentan Peninsula. The 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, battle-hardened paratroopers of the Reich, spearheaded attacks against Sainte-Mère-Église. Supported by artillery, they pushed through hedgerows with disciplined ferocity. The Americans, however, had the advantage of determination and terrain. Each hedgerow became a fortress, every farmyard a kill zone. Snipers in barns picked off German officers. Machine guns cut swaths through advancing infantry. Mortar teams, often down to their last rounds, waited until enemy formations bunched before unleashing devastating barrages. At La Fière, the 82nd endured relentless attempts to seize the stone bridge. German tanks advanced repeatedly, only to be knocked out by bazooka teams darting from cover or by mines laid in desperation. For 3 days the bridge was contested, and each day it remained in American hands. The invasion grew more secure. Carentan, the crucial link, perhaps the most pivotal battle for the airborne, came at Carentan, a town whose capture was essential to link the Utah and Omaha beachheads. Without Carentan, American forces would remain divided, vulnerable to being split and destroyed piecemeal. From June 10th to 13th, paratroopers of the 101st fought through the streets of Carentan in some of the most savage urban combat of the campaign. Germans had fortified buildings, laid mines, and positioned machine guns at every intersection. The Screaming Eagles advanced house by house, kicking down doors, clearing rooms with grenades, and battling through sniper fire. On June the 13th, German armour launched a massive counterattack to retake Carentan. Panzers and infantry surged into the fields outside the town, threatening to overwhelm the weary Americans. At that desperate moment, elements of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division arrived, their Shermans clashing with German armour in a thunderous battle. Together, the paratroopers and tank crews repelled the attack. Carentan remained in Allied hands. The victory secured the link between Utah and Omaha, allowing the Americans to expand their foothold in Normandy. For the airborne, it was proof that their sacrifices in the drop zones had not been in vain. The human toll. The cost, however, was staggering. The airborne divisions had suffered thousands of casualties in less than a week. Entire sticks of paratroopers were missing, many presumed drowned in the flooded marshes. Others were buried in makeshift graves, marked by helmets on rifles. Medics worked tirelessly in barns converted into aid stations. Supplies were scarce, morphine ran low, and stretchers filled faster than they could be cleared. French civilians, at great personal risk, aided the Americans, nursing the wounded, carrying messages, and hiding soldiers from German patrols. For the survivors, exhaustion became a constant companion. They fought on little food, with constant fear and grief gnawing at them. Yet the bond forged in those fields, between comrades who had leapt into the night together, grew unbreakable. A soldier's perspective, Private First Class Harold Tex Simmons of the 101st recalled, "We hadn't slept in days. My boots were soaked, my rifle caked in mud. We'd lost half the guys from my stick. But every time I thought about quitting, I'd look around at the others. They weren't quitting. They weren't even thinking about it. We were all in it together, and that was enough." Such testimony reflects the essence of the airborne spirit, endurance against impossible odds. German frustration mounts. For German commanders, the situation grew increasingly desperate. The paratroopers had not only blocked reinforcements, but also emboldened the French resistance. Sabotage increased. Rail lines cut, convoys ambushed, communications severed. Even Hitler's much-vaunted panzer divisions failed to deliver decisive blows. Delayed by confusion and Hitler's indecision, they arrived too late to smash the beachheads. By mid-June, the Allies were firmly entrenched in Normandy, supplied by a continuous stream of men and material pouring across the Channel. The Germans had underestimated the airborne. Instead of isolated raiding parties, they had encountered hardened troops who fought like entire divisions, even when scattered in small bands. The liberation expands. With Carentan secured and Sainte-Mère-Église held, the Americans pushed deeper into Normandy. The 82nd advanced toward Cherbourg, while the 101st patrolled the Cotentin Peninsula, mopping up German strongpoints. Each village liberated brought new challenges, booby traps, ambushes, and sniper fire, but also joyous welcomes from French civilians who had endured years of occupation. Children draped flowers over helmets, women kissed exhausted paratroopers, and farmers shared what little food they had. Liberation had a face, and it was young Americans in muddy uniforms, carrying rifles and wearing the Screaming Eagle or the AA patch of the All-Americans. Legacy in blood and courage. By the end of June 1944, the American airborne had accomplished their mission at a terrible price. Out of the 13,000 men dropped on D-Day, roughly 2,500 were killed or missing, and thousands more wounded. Yet their actions had been decisive. They had seized Sainte-Mère-Église, the first liberated French town, blocked German counterattacks at Lafayette Bridge, secured causeways critical to Utah Beach, captured Carentan, linking American beachheads. Without these achievements, the invasion might have faltered. Their courage turned the tide of history. Eisenhower's judgment. General Eisenhower later reflected that the airborne gamble had been one of the riskiest parts of the invasion, but also one of the most essential. The drops had been chaotic, scattered, and costly. Yet the effect on German command and control was decisive. The Germans never recovered from the paralysis of that first night. The illusion of paratroopers everywhere had created hesitation, and hesitation had doomed their ability to respond in time. The airborne had not just fought battles, they had disrupted an entire theatre of war. The symbol of liberation. Images of airborne paratroopers in Normandy became symbols of the Allied cause. Photographs of young men crouched in hedgerows, faces streaked with grime and sweat, rifles clutched tight, circulated around the world. For Americans back home, they were proof that their sons were striking the enemy directly. For occupied peoples, they were proof that liberation was real. Sainte-Mère-Église, with its church steeple where John Steele had dangled during the night drop, became a living monument. To this day, a parachute still hangs from that steeple, a tribute to the men who fell from the sky and brought freedom with them. Lessons for modern warfare. The Normandy airborne operation reshaped military thinking. It proved that airborne troops could play a decisive role in large-scale invasions, not merely as raiders, but as a full fighting force. It demonstrated the value of flexibility, improvisation, and initiative in battle. Modern armies still study the tactics of Brécourt Manor, the defense of Lafayette, and the capture of Carentan. The lessons of small units holding against superior forces remain timeless. The price of victory. For the men who survived, Normandy left scars both visible and invisible. Many carried wounds for life. Others carried memories they could never share. Friends lost, horrors witnessed, nights spent shivering in foxholes under artillery fire. Yet when asked years later, most would say the same thing. It was worth it. They had fought not only for victory but for one another, for the belief that tyranny could be defeated, and for the liberation of a continent. The final word. The story of America's airborne paratroopers in Normandy is not one of flawless execution. It is a story of chaos, blood, and confusion. Yet it is also a story of courage, resilience, and determination. Dropped into darkness, scattered across hostile fields, they refused to yield. In their defiance, they bought the time and space needed for the greatest invasion in history to succeed. In their sacrifice, they carved a legacy that endures to this day. They were young men, most barely in their 20s, but on the night of June the 5th and the days that followed, they carried the weight of history on their shoulders. and through their secret, or rage, they did not falter. The world remembers them still, as the first to fight on D-Day, the scattered but unbreakable spearhead of freedom.